Imagine waking up shackled in darkness, knowing that your first mistake, a spilled cup, a moment's hesitation, a glance held too long, could earn you a brutal flogging, or worse, a slow death nailed to wooden beams along a Roman road. For millions of souls trapped in the machinery of Roman slavery, this wasn't a nightmare to wake from. Before we continue deeper into these ancient shadows, take a quiet moment to subscribe if these forgotten stories bring you peace. And if you're still drifting with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world as we wander through history's quieter moments. But the inescapable reality of every dawn that broke over the empire. Take a moment now to find your most comfortable position. Let the weight of your own freedom settle around you like a warm blanket, as we prepare to walk in the footsteps of those who knew no such comfort. Tonight, we journey not to the glittering marble halls or triumphant forums that fill our imagination when we think of Rome, but to the shadowed corners where human beings were reduced to living tools, their very breath dependent on the whims of masters who held the power of life and death in their hands. As you settle into this quiet hour, perhaps with the soft glow of lamplight or the gentle hum of night sounds around you, try to imagine what it would feel like to have never known such simple pleasures, to have never chosen when to sleep, what to eat, or even where to direct your gaze. For the slaves of ancient Rome, every moment of existence was dictated by forces beyond their control. Every sunrise a reminder that they were property first, human beings second, if at all. The story we're about to explore together is not one of distant statistics or abstract historical concepts. It is the story of individuals whose names have been lost to time, whose voices were silenced by the very system that used their bodies to build an empire. It is a story written in scars and tears, in the calloused hands that built monuments they would never be free to admire, in the broken backs that carried the stones of their own subjugation. In the comfort of this moment, you might wonder how anyone endured such a life, how the human spirit survived when crushed beneath such systematic cruelty. You might ask yourself, as the title suggests, whether you would last even a single day in their circumstances. These are not idle questions. They speak to something fundamental about human resilience, about the boundaries of suffering, and about the terrible capacity of civilized societies to normalize the unthinkable. As we prepare to step into their world, let yourself breathe deeply and feel grateful for the simple act of choice, the choice to listen, to learn, to remember those who had no choice at all. Feel the freedom in your ability to shift position when uncomfortable, to close your eyes when you wish, to let your mind wander where it will. These small liberties, so basic we rarely notice them, were luxuries beyond imagination for the millions who lived and died in Roman bondage. Tonight, we honor their memory, not by turning away from the harsh realities they faced, but by bearing witness to their experiences. We acknowledge that the gleaming legacy of Roman civilization, its laws, its literature, its architectural marvels that still inspire us today, was built upon a foundation of human suffering so vast and systematic that it challenges our understanding of how societies function and how people survive. The slaves we will meet in our journey had no choice but to endure. They could not pause when the stories became too painful, could not step away when the brutality became overwhelming. They lived these experiences day after day, year after year, generation after generation. The least we can do is listen to their stories, to sit with their pain for these few hours, and to remember them not as statistics in a history book, but as fellow human beings who deserved better than the world gave them. So as we begin this exploration, carry with you both the weight of their suffering and the warmth of human compassion. Let yourself feel both the horror of what was done to them and the profound respect for how they endured. In doing so, we transform these dark chapters of history from abstract lessons into personal connections across the centuries. The Rome we are about to enter is not the Rome of Hollywood epics or romantic historical fiction. It is a Rome where human flesh was bought and sold in markets like grain or livestock, where children were born into chains they would never escape, where the morning sun rose on crucified bodies, lining the roads as warnings to the living. It is a Rome where the magnificent aqueducts were built by hands that never freely chose their work, where the sumptuous banquets were served by people who existed solely for the pleasure of others. This is the world where you, had you been born into bondage or captured in war, would have found yourself struggling, not just to survive a single day, but to maintain some shred of human dignity in a system designed to strip away every aspect of your personhood. It is a world where the simplest acts of humanity, showing kindness to a fellow slave, expressing grief for a lost family member, or even smiling without permission, could be seen as acts of defiance punishable by death. As we cross the threshold into this world together, remember that you do so safely, cushioned by centuries and protected by the knowledge that this is just a story, just history, just something that happened to other people in other times. For them, there was no such comfort, no such distance, no such safety. There was only the reality of iron shackles, leather whips, and the constant knowledge that their lives held value only insofar as they could serve those who owned them. Take one more deep breath of free air, feel one more moment of unchosen peace, and then let us step together into a world where such simple dignities were not rights but impossible dreams. Let us walk among the forgotten millions who built an empire with their blood and received only suffering in return. Let us remember them, honor them, and ensure that their stories, no matter how painful, are never again lost to silence. Close your eyes now and let your mind drift back across the centuries to the height of Roman power, when the empire stretched from the windswept moors of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt. Picture yourself standing on the 7 hills of Rome itself, gazing out over a city that was the undisputed center of the civilized world. The morning light catches the gleaming white marble of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, its massive columns reaching toward the heavens like the fingers of gods. The air is sweet with the scent of burning incense from 100 shrines, mixed with the exotic aromas of spices brought from distant India and silk roads that wind through Persian kingdoms. Below you, the Forum Roman buzzes with the energy of empire, senators in purple-striped togas, debating the fate of nations, merchants displaying treasures from lands whose names sound like poetry, and citizens dressed in flowing white, walking with the confident stride of those who know they belong to the greatest civilization the world has ever seen. Listen to the sounds that would fill your ears in this magnificent city. The musical splash of water cascading from the great aqueducts, engineering marvels that bring crystal-clear mountain streams flowing across hundreds of miles to feed the thirsty capital. The rhythmic hammering of craftsmen working precious metals into objects of stunning beauty. The melodious calls of street vendors offering delicacies from every corner of the known world, honeyed dates from Damascus, rare wines aged in caves beneath the hills of Gaul, pearls pulled from the depths of British waters. In the distance you might catch a glimpse of the Campus Martius, where young Roman citizens train for military service, their bronze shields flashing in the sunlight as they practice the formations that have conquered half the world. Their disciplined movements speak of a military machine so perfectly organized, so brilliantly led, that it seems destined to march on forever, bringing Roman law, Roman roads, and Roman civilization to every corner of the earth. Turn your gaze toward the Palatine Hill, where the emperor's palace complex rises like a small city unto itself. Gardens cascade down terrace slopes, filled with exotic plants and trees brought as tribute from conquered lands. Peacocks strut across manicured lawns, their jeweled plumage catching the light like living gemstones. Marble statues of gods and heroes line pathways that seem to lead into paradise itself, each one carved by master artists whose skill rivals that of the ancient Greeks. The very air seems to shimmer with prosperity and achievement. Everywhere you look, you see evidence of Roman ingenuity and ambition. The straight as arrow roads that connect every corner of the empire, built so perfectly that they will still be used 2,000 years in the future. The massive amphitheatres where the finest entertainments in the world are staged for the delight of citizens who consider such spectacles their birthright. The libraries filled with scrolls containing the accumulated wisdom of generations. The bathhouses where even common citizens can enjoy luxuries that would make kings from other lands weep with envy. This is Rome at its zenith, a civilization so advanced, so refined, so magnificent, that it seems to represent the very pinnacle of human achievement. The legal system here has given birth to concepts of justice that will influence law for millennia. The literature produced in this city will be studied and admired by scholars until the end of time. The architectural innovations pioneered here will inspire builders and dreamers across countless centuries. Watch as a wedding procession makes its way through the streets, the bride resplendent in saffron-colored silk, her family and friends singing traditional songs that echo off the marble walls of surrounding buildings. See how even this private celebration becomes a public festival, with passers-by offering good wishes and children running alongside to catch the flower petals and honeyed nuts thrown by generous guests. Notice the incredible diversity of this cosmopolitan city. Citizens from every province of the empire have made their way here, bringing their traditions, their foods, their arts, and their gods. Greek philosophers debate in public squares, Egyptian priests tend to exotic temples, and Germanic traders offer furs and amber from the mysterious northern forests. It is a place where the best of the entire world has been gathered and refined into something greater than the sum of its parts. The wealth on display is staggering. Private homes rival palaces, their walls adorned with frescoes that tell stories of gods and heroes, their floors covered in intricate mosaics that transform walking into an art form. Gardens compete with one another in their beauty and extravagance, featuring rare flowers that bloom in impossible combinations, fountains that create music with their flowing water, and aviaries filled with songbirds whose melodies have been trained to harmonize. Even the public spaces speak of a society that has conquered not just territory but scarcity itself. The great baths are open to all citizens, offering not just cleanliness but luxury. Hot pools, cold plunges, massage rooms, libraries, and social spaces where the business of empire is conducted in settings of unparalleled comfort. The theatres and amphitheatres provide entertainment on a scale that dwarfs anything the world has known before, with productions so elaborate and spectacular that they seem to bend the very laws of nature. This is the Rome that captures our imagination, the Rome of glory and achievement, of marble and gold, of power and beauty that seems eternal. It is the Rome of Caesar and Cicero, of triumph and majesty, of a civilization so confident in its own greatness that it cannot imagine a world where it does not reign supreme. It is a Rome that seems to prove that human beings, when properly organized and motivated, can create heaven on earth. But as we stand in wonder at this magnificent spectacle, as we breathe in the incense-sweetened air and listen to the sounds of prosperity and power, we must prepare ourselves for a different truth. For this gleaming surface, this breathtaking display of civilization and refinement, rests upon foundations that we have not yet seen. But now, as the sun climbs higher in the Roman sky and the shadows begin to shift, let us step away from the marble facades and golden ornaments. Let us move beyond the carefully cultivated gardens and the triumphant processions, for beneath this dazzling surface of imperial glory lies a different world entirely, a world that the citizens in their fine togas prefer not to see, a reality that the poets in their verses choose not to sing. Listen more carefully now to the sounds of the city, and you will begin to hear what you missed before. Beneath the melodious calls of merchants and the rhythmic chanting of religious ceremonies, there are other sounds, the crack of leather whips echoing from narrow alleyways, the rattle of iron chains being dragged across stone floors, the muffled sobs of human beings who have learned that crying too loudly brings only more pain. Look more closely at those magnificent buildings, those soaring temples and graceful arches, and ask yourself, who lifted those massive stones into place? Who mixed the mortar that holds them together? Who carved the intricate decorations that make them beautiful? The answer is not found in the histories written by senators or the poems composed by court favorites. The answer lies in the scarred hands and broken backs of millions of human beings, whose names were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged, whose very existence was considered beneath notice. This is the Rome that history often overlooks, the Rome that existed in the shadows of those gleaming monuments, in the cellars beneath those luxurious homes, in the workshops behind those prosperous markets. It is a Rome where human beings were bought and sold like cattle, where children were separated from their mothers before they could walk, where the simple act of learning to read could be punished by death if done without permission. Imagine, if you can, waking up tomorrow morning, not in your own bed, but chained to the floor of a stone cell with dozens of other human beings, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and human waste. Imagine knowing that your life belongs entirely to someone else, that every breath you take is granted at their pleasure, that every moment of rest you steal might be your last if your master decides you have been idle too long. This was the daily reality for more than 1/3 of all people living in the Roman Empire. In the city of Rome itself, nearly half of all inhabitants lived as property rather than people. These were not criminals being punished for wrongdoing, not prisoners of war being temporarily detained until some future release. These were human beings, men, women, and children, who had been reduced to the legal status of tools, valued only for the work they could perform and the wealth they could generate for their owners. The contrast between the Rome of glory and the Rome of suffering was not accidental. It was not some unfortunate side effect of an otherwise noble civilization. It was the very foundation upon which everything else was built. Every marble column in those magnificent temples was quarried by slaves working in conditions so brutal that few survived more than a few years. Every feast in those luxurious homes was prepared and served by human beings who were forbidden to taste the food they cooked. Every beautiful garden was tended by people who would be beaten if they were caught resting in the shade of the trees they watered. The Romans themselves understood this relationship, even if they preferred not to speak of it openly. They knew that their leisure depended on others' labor, that their wealth was built on others' poverty, that their freedom was sustained by others' bondage. But they had created an elaborate system of justification that allowed them to live with this knowledge. They told themselves that slaves were naturally inferior, that they deserved their fate, that they were better off being owned by civilized Romans than living free in barbarian lands. These justifications allowed Romans to watch human beings being torn apart by wild animals in their amphitheaters and call it entertainment. They allowed them to crucify runaway slaves along their roads and call it justice. They allowed them to work children to death in their mines and call it economic necessity. The cognitive dissonance was resolved not by changing the system, but by convincing themselves that those who suffered in it were somehow less than fully human. Yet even as they constructed these elaborate justifications, the Romans lived in constant fear of the very people they oppressed. They passed law after law designed to prevent slave rebellions, created punishment systems so brutal they defy imagination, and lived behind locked doors guarded by loyal freedmen, because they knew, deep in their hearts, that no human being accepts slavery willingly. The magnificent civilization we admire was built not just on slave labor, but on slave terror, the systematic use of fear to keep millions of people working against their will. The irony is profound and tragic. The same culture that gave us concepts of law and justice also created the most sophisticated system of human bondage the world had ever seen. The same people who wrote eloquently about virtue and honor also inflicted unimaginable cruelty on their fellow human beings as a matter of routine. The same society that celebrated human achievement also denied the very humanity of those whose achievements made their own possible. This contradiction lay at the heart of Roman civilization, hidden beneath its beautiful surface but essential to its very existence. You cannot understand Rome without understanding slavery, just as you cannot understand slavery without recognizing how it shaped every aspect of Roman life. The poetry was written by slave secretaries, the wine was made by slave vineyard workers, the clothes were woven by slave women, the roads were built by slave construction crews, and the very foundations of the buildings were laid by slave hands. As we prepare to descend deeper into this hidden world, to walk among those forgotten millions whose suffering built an empire, remember that we are not exploring some distant alien culture. We are examining the dark foundation upon which much of our own civilization was built. The legal principles we still use, the architectural styles that still inspire us, the literature we still read, all of it emerged from a society that treated human beings as property and considered this arrangement both natural and necessary. This is the Rome you are about to enter, not as a tourist marveling at ancient wonders, but as a witness to human suffering on a scale that challenges our understanding of how societies function and how people survive. Prepare yourself, for you are about to discover why surviving even a single day in this hidden Rome would test the very limits of human endurance. To truly comprehend the world we are about to enter, we must first grasp the staggering magnitude of human bondage that defined Roman society. The numbers alone are enough to challenge everything we think we know about how civilizations function and what human beings are capable of enduring. Picture, if you will, the entire population of modern-day Canada, nearly 40 million people, living in chains. Imagine every third person you see on the street, in shops, in homes, existing not as a free human being, but as someone else's property. This was the reality of the Roman Empire at its height, where conservative estimates suggest that between 12 and 15 million human beings lived in various forms of slavery across the Mediterranean world. But even these vast numbers fail to capture the true scope of the system. In the Italian heartland of the empire, the concentration was far more intense. Archaeological evidence and ancient records suggest that in some regions of southern Italy and Sicily, slaves outnumbered free citizens by margins of 3 or even 4 to 1. Entire landscapes were transformed into what we might recognize today as concentration camps, where hundreds of thousands of human beings lived, worked, and died for the profit of their owners. Consider the island of Sicily alone, where the massive wheat estates known as latifundia stretched across thousands upon thousands of acres. Roman writers casually mention agricultural operations that employed 15,000 slaves on a single estate. These were not occasional large holdings, but the standard model of production that fed the growing cities of the empire. The geographer Strabo wrote with admiration about plantations where the eye cannot see from one end to the other, worked entirely by human beings who had no choice in their labor and no hope of escape. The slave markets themselves reveal the industrial scale of this human trafficking. The island of Delos, a major trading hub in the eastern Mediterranean, could process up to 10,000 slaves in a single day during peak seasons. Ancient inscriptions record sales receipts for shipments of 2,000 and 3,000 people at a time, bought and sold with no more ceremony than cattle or grain. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder noted that the markets of Rome processed an average of 500 new slaves every day of the year, nearly 200,000 human beings annually flowing through the capital city alone. These numbers become even more staggering when we consider that they represent not just adults but entire families torn apart by the machinery of enslavement. Archaeological excavations of slave quarters reveal children's toys and small shoes, evidence of lives that began and often ended in bondage. Legal documents from Pompeii show that approximately 60% of all slaves in that city were under the age of 30, and nearly a quarter were children under 15. These were not temporary arrangements or punishment for crimes. This was systematic exploitation of human beings from birth to death. The economic magnitude is equally overwhelming. Modern economic historians estimate that slave labor produced between 30 and 40% of the total economic output of the Roman Empire. To put this in contemporary terms, imagine if today's global economy depended on forced labor for nearly half of all goods and services. Every third building you see was constructed by slaves, every other piece of clothing was made by slaves, every second meal was prepared by slaves. The wealth that supported Roman civilization, the taxes that funded the legions, the luxury goods that filled elite homes, the public works that impressed visitors from around the world, all of it flowed from the unpaid labor of millions of human beings. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of these statistics is how normalized this immense suffering had become. Roman legal codes contain thousands of regulations governing the treatment, sale, and punishment of slaves, written with the same dispassionate precision used for livestock management. The historian Tacitus writes about slave revolts not as humanitarian crises, but as economic disruptions that threatened property values and trade routes. The sheer logistics of maintaining this system required a vast apparatus of control and violence. Archaeological evidence suggests that Rome alone housed at least 50 major slave prisons, each capable of holding hundreds of captives awaiting sale or punishment. The city maintained a permanent force of slave catchers, professional hunters whose job was to track down runaways and return them to their owners. Crucifixion sites lined every major road leading in and out of the capital, serving as perpetual reminders of what awaited those who dared to seek freedom. Even more disturbing is the evidence of how this system perpetuated itself across generations. Legal documents show that the children of slaves automatically inherited their parents' status, creating hereditary bondage that trapped bloodlines for centuries. Genetic studies of ancient Roman burial sites suggest that some family lines remained enslaved for 10 or more generations, their genetic markers appearing in slave quarters across multiple centuries of excavation layers. The transportation networks required to move these millions of human beings across the empire were as sophisticated as any military operation. Purpose-built slave ships, some capable of carrying over 1,000 captives at once, plied regular routes between conquest zones and major markets. Roman engineering marvels like roads and bridges served double duty, facilitating not just trade and military movement, but the constant flow of human cargo from the periphery to the center of the empire. What makes these numbers truly incomprehensible is that they represent individual human stories, mothers separated from their children, fathers who watched their families sold to different owners, children who grew up never knowing their parents' names or the lands of their birth. Each statistic encompasses a universe of grief, terror, and broken dreams that we can barely imagine from our comfortable distance of 2 millennia. And yet, for all the overwhelming scale of this system, perhaps the most shocking fact is how little most Romans thought about it. To them, slavery was simply part of the natural order, as unremarkable as the sunrise or the changing of the seasons. They could walk past slave markets, sleep in beds made by slaves, eat food prepared by slaves, and wear clothes sewn by slaves without any sense that they were participating in something monstrous. The magnitude of suffering had become invisible through sheer familiarity. This is the world you would have entered as a slave in ancient Rome, not as one person facing individual hardship, but as one tiny part of a vast machine designed to extract every ounce of value from human bodies and human lives. Understanding this scale is crucial because it reveals why resistance was so difficult, why escape was nearly impossible, and why the system could continue for centuries without challenge. You would not be facing merely a cruel master or harsh conditions, but an entire civilization organized around your exploitation. Now that we understand the overwhelming scale of Roman slavery, we must examine how this monstrous system came to be. For you would not have simply awakened one morning to find yourself in chains. Your enslavement would have been the result of specific, deliberate actions taken by the Roman state and its citizens. Understanding these pathways into bondage reveals just how easily any free person could find themselves trapped in this nightmare. The most common route to slavery was through the endless wars of Roman expansion. As the legions marched across Europe, Africa, and Asia, they left behind a trail of shattered communities and captured populations. The Roman military machine was designed not just to conquer territory but to harvest human beings as one of the primary spoils of victory. Military commanders understood that slaves were often more valuable than gold or silver, providing decades of labor rather than a single payment. Consider the systematic devastation of Gaul under Julius Caesar. His own writings, penned with casual pride, describe the capture and enslavement of over 500,000 Gallic people during his 8-year campaign. Entire tribes were marched south in chains, men, women, children, and elderly, to be sold in the markets of Rome. Caesar's commentaries mention one battle where 53,000 prisoners were taken in a single day, all destined for slavery. These were not soldiers, but civilians whose only crime was living in villages that Caesar wanted to control. The process was brutally efficient. Roman military engineers designed portable slave processing facilities that could be quickly assembled near battlefields. Captives would be sorted by age, health, and apparent skill level, then branded with hot irons to mark them as property of the Roman state. Families were deliberately separated during this initial processing, partly for practical transportation reasons but also to break psychological bonds that might encourage resistance or escape attempts. But warfare was only one pathway into bondage. The Roman economy itself generated slaves through its legal and financial systems. Debt slavery entrapped thousands of free Romans who had fallen on hard times. A farmer whose crops failed due to drought or disease might borrow money to survive, only to find himself unable to repay when the next harvest also proved inadequate. Roman law allowed creditors to seize not just property but the debtor's person and family members as compensation. Children born to debt slaves automatically inherited their parents' obligations, creating cycles of bondage that could last for generations. The foundling system provided another steady stream of slaves. Roman law permitted fathers to reject newborn children by literally casting them out of the household. These abandoned infants, disproportionately female, disabled, or born to unmarried mothers, became the property of whoever found them. Professional slave dealers maintained networks of agents who would collect these discarded children from roadsides and refuse heaps, raising them just enough to make them suitable for sale. Archaeological evidence from Roman dumps reveals the skeletal remains of thousands of unwanted infants, while legal documents show that foundling slaves commanded premium prices due to their malleability. Kidnapping and piracy flourished as semi-legitimate businesses throughout the Mediterranean. Criminal organizations operated with tacit government approval, as long as they targeted non-Roman populations and paid appropriate taxes on their human cargo. The pirates of Cilicia, for instance, maintained a fleet of over 1,000 ships dedicated to slave raiding. They would descend on coastal villages, capture everyone they could, and transport them to specialized slave markets where no questions were asked about origins or circumstances of capture. Even birth itself was a pathway to slavery. Roman law held that children inherited the legal status of their mothers at the moment of conception. This meant that any child born to a slave woman, regardless of who the father might be, became property from their first breath. Masters often encouraged breeding among their slaves, calculating that the investment in feeding pregnant women and young children would pay dividends when those children reached working age. Some large estates maintained detailed breeding records, tracking bloodlines like livestock to optimize their human inventory. The legal system itself created slaves through its punishment mechanisms. Courts could sentence criminals to various forms of slavery, from temporary servitude in the mines to permanent bondage in gladiatorial schools. Political dissidents, religious minorities, and anyone who challenged Roman authority might find themselves condemned to slavery as a means of removing them from society while still extracting value from their bodies. Even witnessing certain crimes or refusing to testify against friends could result in enslavement under Roman law. Perhaps most chilling was how the system fed on itself. Slaves who attempted escape faced not just recapture, but often saw their punishment extended to family members and fellow slaves. The legal doctrine of collective punishment meant that if one slave in a household committed a serious crime, the master had the right to execute or sell every slave under his roof. This created a network of mutual surveillance and control where slaves were forced to police each other's behavior to protect themselves. The bureaucratic apparatus that managed these various streams of enslavement was remarkably sophisticated. The Roman state maintained detailed records of slave transactions, including registries of births, sales, transfers, and deaths. Tax collectors specialized in assessing the value of human property, and government officials certified the authenticity of slave brands and documentation. This wasn't a chaotic or haphazard system, it was a carefully organized industry designed to maximize the extraction of human beings from every possible source. What made this system so terrifyingly effective was its legal foundation. Roman law treated slaves not as people temporarily deprived of freedom, but as objects that had never possessed human rights. This legal framework made every pathway into slavery, war, debt, abandonment, kidnapping, birth, or criminal punishment, not just socially acceptable but economically rational. The system didn't need to justify itself because it had created a worldview in which enslaved people were property by their very nature, regardless of how they had come to be enslaved. Now let us step into the sandaled feet of someone who has fallen into this system and experience what your typical day would look like as a Roman slave. For most enslaved people, each dawn brought not hope or possibility, but the grinding repetition of labor designed to break both body and spirit. Your survival would depend not on your talents or dreams, but on your ability to endure conditions that would challenge every assumption you hold about human endurance. Your day would begin before the sun touched the horizon, awakened not by natural light or personal choice, but by the harsh voice of an overseer or the clanging of iron bells. In the slave quarters, cramped windowless cells carved from stone or built from the cheapest materials, you would rise from a thin mat or pile of straw that served as your bed. The air around you would be thick with the breathing of dozens of other human beings packed into spaces designed for far fewer, the smell of unwashed bodies and human waste a constant presence that you would never fully escape. If you were fortunate enough to be a household slave in a wealthy home, your quarters might be slightly better, perhaps a small room shared with only 3 or 4 others, located in the basement or rear sections of the house where the family would never have to see or smell your living conditions. But even this relative luxury came with its own torments. You would be on call at all hours, expected to appear instantly when summoned, regardless of whether you were eating, sleeping, or tending to personal needs. Your morning routine would consist of whatever minimal hygiene you could manage with cold water from a communal basin, if water was available at all. Slaves were typically allocated one change of clothing, a rough tunic made from the coarsest wool or cheapest linen, which you would wear until it literally fell apart. Personal possessions were non-existent beyond perhaps a small knife for eating, or a worn piece of cloth for additional warmth. Food, when it came, would be designed for survival rather than sustenance. A typical slave's daily ration consisted of about 2 pounds of bread made from the lowest grade flour, often mixed with sawdust or other fillers to stretch the supply. This might be supplemented with a small portion of beans or lentils, occasionally some thin soup made from kitchen scraps, and on rare occasions a piece of salted fish or fatty meat too poor for the master's table. Clean drinking water was often scarce, replaced by watered-down wine or whatever liquid could be found. The work itself would vary depending on your assignment, but all slave labor shared certain characteristics. It was physically demanding, mentally numbing, and performed under constant threat of violence. Agricultural slaves faced perhaps the harshest conditions, working in the fields from sunrise until well past sunset during harvest seasons. The tools were crude and heavy: iron hoes, wooden plows, sharp sickles that could easily cut flesh as well as grain. Your hands would quickly become a mass of calluses and cuts, your back permanently bent from bending over crops, your skin burned and weathered from constant exposure to sun and rain. Household slaves faced different but equally challenging demands. A kitchen slave might spend 18 hours a day preparing elaborate meals they would never taste, standing over hot fires in poorly ventilated spaces that reached temperatures well over 100 degrees. A cleaning slave would be expected to maintain the spotless condition of rooms and furnishings worth more than entire villages, knowing that a single stain or broken object could result in severe punishment. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than the physical demands. You would be forbidden from making eye contact with free citizens, required to step into gutters when they passed, and expected to respond to any command with immediate obedience. Your name, if you had been allowed to keep it, would rarely be used. Most slaves were simply called boy or girl, regardless of their age, or given new names chosen by their masters for convenience or amusement. Rest, when it came, was brief and always uncertain. Even during the few hours allocated for sleep, you might be awakened for emergency tasks, sexual services, or simply because a master or overseer was drunk and wanted entertainment. Privacy was unknown. You would eat, sleep, work, and even relieve yourself under constant observation. The concept of personal time or individual choice would gradually fade from your memory. until the idea of making decisions for yourself became as foreign as the idea of sprouting wings. The constant threat of violence hung over every moment. Roman law granted masters nearly unlimited power over their slaves' bodies, and this power was exercised regularly to maintain control. Beatings were so common they were barely noted in household records. A dropped plate, a moment's hesitation in following orders, even an expression on your face that could be interpreted as defiant. Any of these could result in a flogging that left you unable to work for days. The work week had no end. There were no weekends, no holidays that applied to slaves, no scheduled breaks or vacation time. Religious festivals might provide brief respites from labor, but even then, slaves were often required to work harder to prepare for celebrations they would not be allowed to enjoy. Your life would become an endless cycle of exhaustion, pain, and the constant calculation of how to survive one more day without provoking punishment. Perhaps most crushing of all was the complete absence of hope for change. Free people who faced hardship could at least imagine that circumstances might improve, that hard work might lead to better conditions, that tomorrow might bring new opportunities. As a slave, you would quickly learn that your situation was permanent. Your children, if you were allowed to have them, would inherit your bondage. Your best qualities, intelligence, creativity, kindness, would be twisted into tools for your master's benefit rather than sources of personal fulfillment. This was not just a difficult life. It was a systematic destruction of everything that makes human existence meaningful. You would not be struggling against temporary hardship or working toward future goals. You would be trapped in a daily routine designed to extract maximum value from your body, while ensuring that your spirit remained broken enough to prevent resistance. Yet even within this system designed to crush the human spirit, there were those who refused to accept their fate quietly. Their stories of resistance reveal both the incredible courage of the human heart and the terrible price that defiance demanded in the world of Roman slavery. Perhaps no story illustrates this better than that of Brixus, a Celtic warrior whose name has been lost to official histories, but whose rebellion shook the foundations of Roman Sicily. Brixus had been a chieftain among the Arverni, leading raids against Roman outposts along the Rhine frontier until a coordinated assault by 3 legions overwhelmed his hill fort in the winter of 139 BCE. Captured alive after watching his wife and children cut down before his eyes, he was shipped south to Sicily to work the vast wheat estates that fed the growing population of Rome. At 35 years of age, Brixus found himself stripped of everything that had defined his existence: his freedom, his family, his identity as a warrior and leader of men. For 2 years Brixus labored in the fields under the scorching Sicilian sun, his once powerful frame slowly wearing down under the relentless demands of agricultural work. The overseers took particular pleasure in humiliating this former chieftain, forcing him to crawl on hands and knees to pick weeds, beating him for the slightest hesitation, and ensuring that he received the smallest food rations and the hardest assignments. They believed they were breaking not just one man, but the spirit of Celtic resistance itself. But they had gravely miscalculated. Brixus was not simply enduring his suffering. He was studying the system that enslaved him, learning its weaknesses, and quietly building networks of trust among his fellow slaves. During the brief rest periods between work shifts, he would speak in hushed tones with other captured warriors, Gauls, Germans, Thracians, and even former Roman soldiers who had been enslaved for desertion or rebellion. He discovered that the estate held nearly 3,000 slaves, most of whom harbored the same burning resentment that consumed his own heart. The opportunity came during the festival of Ceres in the autumn of 137 BCE. The estate's owners and overseers had traveled to Syracuse for the celebrations, leaving behind only a skeleton crew to guard the slaves. Brixus had spent months preparing for this moment, secretly collecting makeshift weapons, sharpened farming tools, kitchen knives, even stones that could serve as projectiles. More importantly, he had identified which slaves could be trusted and which positions they held throughout the estate. The rebellion began at midnight, when Brixus and 12 trusted accomplices overpowered the guards at the main gate. Moving with the tactical precision of his warrior days, they seized the estate's armory and freed the slaves from their locked quarters. Within hours, the entire plantation was under rebel control, its owners and overseers either dead or fled. But Brixus understood that this was only the beginning. A successful revolt required more than just one estate. Word of the uprising spread like wildfire across Sicily, carried by escaped slaves and sympathetic field workers. Within a week, similar rebellions had erupted on 6 other major estates. The rebels adopted guerrilla tactics, striking Roman settlements and military outposts before melting back into the countryside. Brixus proved to be as capable a commander in rebellion as he had been in his Celtic homeland, organizing supply lines, training freed slaves in combat, and coordinating attacks across the island. For 8 months the rebellion raged across Sicily. Roman records, written with obvious frustration, describe rebel forces that seemed to appear from nowhere, strike with devastating effectiveness, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. Brixus had created something that terrified Roman authorities more than any foreign invasion, a coordinated uprising of the very people upon whom their economy depended. The rebels controlled large swaths of the Sicilian countryside, establishing temporary settlements where freed slaves could experience something approaching normal family life. Former house slaves worked alongside former field hands to create communities based on mutual aid rather than exploitation. Children who had never known freedom played in these camps while their parents planned the next phase of their war against Roman tyranny. But the Romans could not allow such a precedent to stand. The rebellion threatened not just Sicilian agriculture, but the fundamental assumptions upon which their entire society was built. If slaves could successfully revolt in Sicily, what would prevent similar uprisings in Italy itself, or in the provinces where millions more lived in bondage? The Senate authorized unprecedented military resources to crush the rebellion, sending 4 legions under the command of the consul Lucius Calpurnius Piso. The end came at the Battle of Mount Caprianus in the spring of 136 BCE. Brixus had positioned his forces on the mountain slopes, hoping to use the terrain to offset the Romans' superior numbers and equipment. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the tactics might work. The rebel charge broke the first Roman assault and sent veteran legionaries fleeing down the mountainside. But Roman military discipline ultimately prevailed. Fresh troops moved up to replace the scattered units, while cavalry circled around to attack the rebels from behind. Brixus fought like the warrior he had always been, cutting down Roman soldiers even as his own forces crumbled around him. When he finally fell, pierced by multiple spear thrusts, he was still trying to rally his men for one last charge. The aftermath was as brutal as the rebellion itself had been inspiring. Roman forces swept across Sicily, recapturing escaped slaves and punishing any who had supported the uprising. Over 20,000 rebels were crucified along the island's roads, their bodies left to rot as warnings to any who might contemplate similar defiance. The estates were rebuilt, the slave quarters reinforced, and new laws passed making any assistance to rebellious slaves punishable by death. Yet, Brixus's rebellion was not a failure, despite its tragic end. For 8 months, thousands of human beings had tasted freedom. had lived as something more than property, had proved to themselves and their oppressors that the spirit of resistance could not be entirely crushed. The name of Brixus was whispered in slave quarters across the empire, inspiring later revolts and keeping alive the dream that bondage need not be permanent. The rebellion also revealed the fundamental weakness of the Roman slave system. It required constant vigilance and brutal repression to maintain itself. Every master now looked at his slaves with suspicion, knowing that beneath their apparent submission might lurk the same fires that had consumed Sicily. The system had survived, but it had been exposed as far more fragile than its supporters liked to admit. Yet, amidst the systematic brutality and dehumanization of Roman slavery, there occasionally emerged relationships that defied the rigid boundaries between master and property. These connections, rare as they were, reveal the complex ways that human beings can find meaning and affection even within the most oppressive circumstances. The story of Marcus Caecilius Atticus and his slave Philemon illustrates how genuine bonds could form across the vast gulf of legal status, while also showing how even the most caring relationships remained fundamentally shaped by the power imbalances of slavery. Atticus was a wealthy grain merchant who had inherited his father's business along with a household of 43 slaves when he was just 22 years old. Unlike many young Romans of his class, who viewed their inherited human property as mere tools for generating wealth, Atticus had been disturbed by what he witnessed in his childhood home. He remembered his father's casual cruelty, the way slaves would flinch when approached, the atmosphere of fear that permeated the household despite its outward prosperity. Among the slaves he inherited was Philemon, a Greek scholar who had been captured during a pirate raid on the island of Rhodes 15 years earlier. Philemon had once been a respected teacher of rhetoric and philosophy, a man who had commanded the attention of wealthy citizens eager to educate their children in the classical arts. Now approaching his 50th year, he served as Atticus's personal secretary and tutor, handling correspondence and managing the complex records required for international trade. What began as a conventional master-slave relationship gradually evolved into something more complex. Atticus found himself genuinely impressed by Philemon's intelligence and learning, often seeking his advice not just on business matters but on literature, philosophy, and even personal decisions. Philemon, for his part, recognized that he had been fortunate to land in a household where his intellectual gifts were valued rather than ignored or punished. Their daily interactions took on an almost conversational quality that would have shocked other Romans. During long evenings when Atticus worked on his accounts, Philemon would share stories from his former life as a teacher, describing the philosophical debates he had witnessed in Rhodes or recounting passages from Greek literature that seemed relevant to their discussions. Atticus began to think of these sessions not as work but as the intellectual companionship he had always craved but never found among his peers in Rome's merchant class. The turning point in their relationship came during a particularly difficult business crisis. Pirates had captured one of Atticus's grain ships, and corrupt officials in Alexandria were demanding bribes that would bankrupt the company. Atticus had spent sleepless nights trying to find a solution, becoming increasingly desperate as creditors demanded payment and employees worried about their livelihoods. It was Philemon who suggested a creative solution, restructuring the debt using a combination of Greek financial instruments and Roman legal precedents that would buy them time to recover. More importantly, Philemon volunteered to travel to Alexandria himself to negotiate with the officials. This offer represented enormous personal risk for a slave, as traveling outside his master's direct protection left him vulnerable to capture, abuse, or even being sold to cover debts. Yet Philemon insisted that his knowledge of Greek customs and his experience with bureaucratic corruption made him the best choice for the mission. The 6-month journey proved successful. saving Atticus's business and establishing new trading relationships that would prove profitable for years to come. But the experience also forced both men to confront the contradictions in their relationship. Philemon had acted with the initiative and responsibility of a business partner, yet legally he remained property that could be sold or punished at will. Atticus had trusted him with decisions that affected dozens of families and thousands of denarii, yet could not grant him the basic human dignity of legal freedom. Upon Philemon's return, Atticus made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He began treating Philemon more like a trusted advisor than a slave. He gave him private quarters rather than shared slave housing, allowed him to keep a portion of the profits from successful negotiations, and even sought his opinion on household management decisions. Most remarkably, he began including Philemon in social dinners with other merchants, introducing him not as my slave, but simply as my colleague Philemon. This arrangement scandalized Atticus's social circle. Other wealthy Romans accused him of undermining the natural order, of encouraging dangerous ideas among his other slaves, and of showing weakness that would invite rebellion or theft. Some refused to do business with him, claiming that a man who could not properly control his slaves could not be trusted with commercial agreements. The pressure from his peers was intense and constant. Yet Atticus persisted in this unusual relationship, finding in Philemon not just a valuable employee but genuine friendship. They would spend hours discussing philosophy, literature, and the complexities of human nature. Philemon introduced Atticus to Stoic philosophy, teaching him to find meaning in virtue rather than just material success. Atticus in turn shared his dreams of reforming Roman business practices to be less exploitative of both slaves and free workers. The relationship was not without its tensions and contradictions. Despite their mutual respect and affection, Philemon could never forget that his life ultimately belonged to another person. He could be sold, punished, or even killed if Atticus changed his mind or died without making legal provisions for his protection. This underlying vulnerability created moments of friction, particularly when Philemon felt that his advice was being ignored, or when Atticus made decisions that reminded him of his powerless status. For Atticus, the friendship created its own moral complications. The more he came to respect Philemon as an equal, the more uncomfortable he became with legally owning another human being. Yet freeing Philemon would not only cost him a valuable advisor, but would also require him to confront the fact that he continued to hold 42 other human beings in bondage. If Philemon deserved freedom because of his intelligence and service, what did that say about the kitchen slaves, field workers and cleaning staff who also served his household faithfully? Their relationship lasted for 12 years, until Atticus died unexpectedly of a fever at the age of 34. In his will he granted freedom to Philemon and left him a substantial inheritance, enough to establish himself as an independent teacher in Rome. But he made no provisions for the other slaves in his household, who were divided among his relatives according to their assessed value. Philemon's liberation came at the cost of watching his former colleagues in bondage transferred to new masters who might not be as benevolent as Atticus had been. The story of Atticus and Philemon reveals both the possibility and the limitations of human connection within an inherently dehumanizing system. Their friendship was real and meaningful, providing both men with intellectual stimulation, emotional support, and genuine affection. Yet it existed within a framework of legal and social inequality that could never be fully overcome, no matter how much respect or care existed between them. It was a relationship that humanized both participants while also highlighting the fundamental injustice of a system that made such relationships dependent on the personal whims of masters rather than the inherent rights of human beings. But now we must turn to the darkest corners of Roman slavery, to violations so profound that they challenge our understanding of human cruelty and the depths to which supposedly civilized societies can sink. For beyond the physical brutality and economic exploitation lay systematic attacks on the most fundamental aspects of human dignity, attacks that were not aberrations or excesses, but integral features of how the Roman slave system functioned. Perhaps no aspect of Roman slavery was more devastating than the deliberate destruction of family bonds. Roman law recognized no legal relationship between enslaved parents and their children, no marriage rights for slaves, no protection for the most basic human connections that give life meaning. This was not an oversight or unintended consequence. It was a calculated strategy designed to prevent the formation of loyalties that might challenge a slave's absolute devotion to their master. Consider the fate of Lydia, a young woman from Galatia who was captured along with her infant daughter during a military campaign in 118 BCE. Sold to a wealthy Roman matron named Claudia Pulchra, Lydia was initially allowed to keep her child while serving as a wet nurse for Claudia's own newborn son. For 6 months she nursed both children, finding some comfort in being able to care for her daughter even within the confines of slavery. But when Claudia's son was weaned, the situation changed dramatically. The mistress decided that Lydia's attachment to her own child was making her less attentive to household duties. One morning, without warning or explanation, slave traders arrived to take the little girl away. Lydia's screams and pleas were ignored as her daughter was loaded onto a cart bound for the slave markets of Ephesus, where young children commanded high prices from buyers looking for easily trainable servants. Lydia never saw her daughter again. She had no legal right to know where the child had been sold, no ability to send messages or gifts, no hope of ever being reunited. The grief nearly destroyed her mind. She stopped eating, refused to work, and spent her days sitting motionless in whatever corner she could find. Claudia's response was not sympathy but irritation at her slave's ungrateful behavior. Lydia was beaten regularly for her lack of enthusiasm, told that she should be thankful for the food and shelter she received, and reminded that her child was probably better off with new owners who could provide proper training. This deliberate severing of family bonds was repeated millions of times across the Roman world. Parents were separated from children, husbands from wives, siblings scattered to different corners of the empire. The trauma was not merely emotional but psychological, designed to break down the sense of identity and belonging that might give slaves the strength to resist or the hope to dream of freedom. The sexual exploitation of slaves represented another level of systematic dehumanization that went far beyond individual acts of abuse. Roman law granted masters unlimited sexual access to their slaves, treating their bodies as property to be used for pleasure, reproduction, or entertainment. This wasn't considered rape by Roman standards. The concept simply didn't apply when the victim was legally property rather than a person. Young slaves of both sexes were particularly vulnerable to this exploitation. Boys and girls as young as 12 or 13 were routinely purchased specifically for sexual purposes, their youth and inexperience making them more desirable to Roman buyers with twisted appetites. These children had no understanding of what was being done to them, no advocates to speak on their behalf, no legal recourse when they were injured or diseased by their abuse. The breeding programs implemented on large estates treated human reproduction with the same calculating coldness applied to livestock management. Female slaves were assigned mating partners based on their master's assessment of which combinations would produce the most valuable offspring. Personal preferences, emotional attachments, or basic human dignity played no role in these decisions. Women were expected to produce children regularly, and those who failed to conceive quickly enough might be sold or punished for their deficiency. Cassia, a Germanic woman enslaved at age 16, was forced to bear 8 children over 12 years on a Campanian estate. Each child was taken from her at weaning and assigned to different work details or sold to other masters. She was never allowed to develop relationships with her children, never permitted to influence their upbringing, and never given any assurance that they would be well treated. Her function was purely biological, to produce new slaves for her master's profit. The psychological torture inflicted on slaves was perhaps even more devastating than the physical abuse. Masters and overseers seemed to take particular pleasure in devising humiliations that would break their slaves' spirits while leaving their bodies capable of work. Slaves might be forced to participate in degrading entertainment for their master's guests, compelled to inform on fellow slaves to prevent collective resistance, or made to inflict punishments on friends and family members as proof of their loyalty. One of the most psychologically devastating practices was the deliberate cultivation of false hope. Masters would promise freedom to slaves who performed exceptional service, then find excuses to delay or deny the reward when the time came. They would allow slaves to accumulate small amounts of money toward purchasing their freedom, then confiscate these savings for invented infractions. They would dangle the possibility of family reunification as a reward for good behavior, then use this hope as leverage to extract even greater compliance. The degradation extended to every aspect of human dignity. Slaves were forbidden from wearing certain colors or styles of clothing that might allow them to blend in with free citizens. They were required to step aside when free people passed, to avert their eyes in the presence of their social superiors, and to endure public humiliation without showing any sign of resentment or anger. Their names could be changed at will, their personal possessions confiscated without cause, their bodies marked with brands or tattoos that would forever identify them as property. Perhaps most crushing of all was the complete absence of any future to anticipate or plan for. Free people, even those facing hardship, could at least imagine that circumstances might improve, that hard work might lead to better conditions, that their children might have opportunities they themselves had been denied. Slaves lived in an eternal present tense, knowing that tomorrow would bring only more of the same suffering, that their children would inherit the same bondage, that death was the only escape from a system designed to extract every ounce of value from their lives while giving nothing back. This systematic assault on human dignity was not the work of particularly cruel individuals, but the predictable result of a legal and social system that treated human beings as objects. When people are defined as property, when their pain and suffering are invisible to those who profit from their labor, when their most basic needs and desires are considered irrelevant to their function, then the kinds of violations we have described become not just possible but inevitable. The deepest tragedy is that these violations were normalized, accepted as part of the natural order by people who considered themselves civilized and moral. Romans, who would never dream of treating their animals with such cruelty, saw nothing wrong with inflicting far worse on their fellow human beings, simply because those humans had been labeled as slaves. Yet even within this system designed to strip away every vestige of human agency, enslaved people found ways to carve out tiny spaces of autonomy and resistance. These small acts of defiance and self-determination, invisible to their masters but precious to those who performed them, reveal the indomitable nature of the human spirit even under the most crushing oppression. They remind us that no system, however totalitarian, can completely erase the fundamental human need for dignity and choice. In the sprawling household of Senator Gaius Cornelius Maximus, a slave woman named Helena discovered that the key to survival lay not in open resistance, which would bring certain death, but in the careful cultivation of what appeared to be perfect compliance while maintaining hidden networks of mutual support among her fellow slaves. Helena worked in the kitchens, a position that gave her access to information about the household's routines, visitors and moods, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for the other slaves. Helena had learned to read the subtle signs that predicted when the master would be in a violent mood, the particular way he held his shoulders when business deals went poorly, the tone of voice he used when addressing his wife, the amount of wine he consumed at dinner. When she sensed danger approaching, she would find quiet ways to warn the other slaves, a particular arrangement of kitchen utensils that meant stay invisible today, or a hummed melody that signaled the master is looking for someone to punish. More importantly, Helena had developed a system for sharing resources that helped the most vulnerable slaves survive. She knew which cook would save small portions of better food for pregnant women, which gardener would look the other way when sick slaves needed to rest in the tool shed, and which stable hand could be trusted to carry messages between slaves in different parts of the household. This invisible network operated entirely through gesture, glance, and coded behavior that their masters never detected. The network's most important function was protecting children. Slave children in Roman households faced particular dangers. They could be sold at any time, used for sexual purposes by adult family members or guests, or simply killed if they became inconvenient. Helena and her allies developed elaborate systems to shield these children from the worst abuses. They would rotate dangerous assignments so that no single child would be exposed to repeated trauma. They would teach the children how to become invisible when certain family members or visitors were present. Most crucially, they would provide emotional support and education that their masters would never permit. In hidden moments between work shifts, Helena would teach slave children basic skills that might help them survive: how to read facial expressions to predict violence, how to treat common injuries without access to medical care, and how to remember their names and origins even when masters tried to erase their identities. She told them stories from her own homeland in Dacia, keeping alive cultural memories that the Roman system was designed to destroy. The most dangerous but most important service Helena's network provided was emotional support for slaves who were breaking under the psychological pressure of bondage. When Lucius, a young man who had been recently captured in Germania, began talking about suicide as his only escape, Helena organized a careful intervention. Different slaves would find moments to speak with him privately, sharing their own survival strategies, and reminding him that even in slavery, small moments of human connection and kindness made life worth enduring. They taught him the slave's most essential skill: how to project the appearance of acceptance while maintaining inner resistance. This meant learning to lower his eyes without losing his sense of self-worth, to obey orders without surrendering his ability to think critically, and to endure humiliation without allowing it to define his identity. It was a delicate balance that required enormous psychological strength, but it was often the only path to mental survival. Helena's network also found ways to honor human dignity, even within dehumanizing circumstances. When elderly slaves died, they would find ways to give them proper burial rites despite regulations requiring that slave bodies simply be disposed of like garbage. When couples formed emotional bonds despite legal prohibitions against slave marriages, the network would help them find moments for private ceremony and support each other through separations. Perhaps most importantly, they maintained hope by sharing news and rumors from the outside world. Information was a precious commodity in slave quarters. News of slave revolts in other regions, changes in Roman law that might affect their treatment, or simply stories that reminded them they were part of a larger human community beyond their master's walls. A merchant slave who traveled with his master might return with news from other cities, or a house slave might overhear political discussions that revealed which way imperial policy was shifting. The slaves also found ways to preserve their cultural identities despite systematic efforts to erase them. Gauls would teach their children traditional songs, disguising them as work rhythms. Greeks would share philosophical concepts while appearing to discuss practical matters. Germanic slaves would maintain their traditional methods of marking time and seasons, creating calendar systems that gave them some sense of autonomy over their experience of time. Religious practices provided another avenue for maintaining dignity and agency. While slaves were required to participate in their masters' religious observances, they also found ways to maintain their own spiritual traditions. They would honor their ancestral gods in hidden moments, create secret shrines in overlooked corners of the estate, and develop prayer practices that sustained them through the worst periods of abuse and despair. The economic aspects of slave life also provided limited opportunities for agency. Some slaves, particularly those with specialized skills, could earn small amounts of money through tips or extra services. Helena used her position in the kitchen to occasionally trade food for small favors or tools. Over time, she accumulated a tiny collection of personal possessions: a bone needle, a small mirror, a piece of colored cloth that represented her ability to make choices and express preferences even within the constraints of slavery. These small acts of agency served multiple purposes beyond immediate practical benefits. They maintained the psychological skills needed for decision-making, kept alive the sense that individual choices mattered, and preserved the cultural knowledge that would be needed if freedom ever became possible. Most importantly, they created communities of mutual support that provided emotional sustenance in a system designed to isolate and dehumanize its victims. The existence of these networks of resistance and support reveals one of the fundamental contradictions of slavery. The more total the system of control appeared, the more creative and resilient the human responses became. Slaves developed sophisticated forms of communication, organization, and mutual aid that operated completely below their master's awareness. They proved that even the most oppressive circumstances could not entirely eliminate human agency, though the price of maintaining that agency was constant vigilance and enormous personal risk. To understand why surviving as a Roman slave would have tested every limit of human endurance, we must examine not just the institution itself but the people who made it function. The overseers, guards, and fellow slaves who enforced the brutal discipline that kept millions in bondage. These enforcers reveal how systems of oppression corrupt not only those who profit from them, but also those who are trapped within them, creating cycles of cruelty that perpetuate themselves across generations. The most feared figure in any slave's daily existence was the villicus, the slave overseer who managed agricultural estates and urban workshops. These men occupied a unique and terrible position. They were themselves property, yet wielded absolute power over hundreds of other enslaved people. This contradiction created individuals whose cruelty often exceeded even that of their free masters, as they desperately tried to prove their loyalty and value through ever greater displays of ruthlessness. Quintus, a former Germanic warrior who had been enslaved at age 22, exemplified this tragic transformation. For his first 3 years in bondage, he had labored in the fields alongside other captives, sharing their suffering and maintaining his sense of solidarity with fellow slaves. But his intelligence and his ability to speak both Germanic and Latin made him valuable to his master, who eventually promoted him to overseer of the estate's Germanic slaves. The promotion came with a terrible price. Quintus was told explicitly that his own survival depended on maintaining absolute discipline among the workers under his supervision. Any decrease in productivity, any sign of rebellion, any attempt at escape would result not just in punishment for the guilty slaves, but in Quintus being stripped of his position and returned to the fields, or worse, sold to the mines where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. To prove his worthiness for this position, Quintus was required to publicly flog 3 slaves who had been caught resting during work hours. These were men he had known for years, men who had shared their meager food with him when he was sick, men who had become as close to brothers as the slave system allowed. But Quintus understood that any show of mercy would be interpreted as weakness, marking him for demotion or death. He administered the beatings with mechanical precision, his face a mask of indifference while his soul died a little more with each stroke of the whip. Over time, this psychological armor became more than just a survival strategy. It became his identity. Quintus discovered that cruelty, once adopted as a necessity, had a way of reshaping the person who practiced it. He found himself looking for signs of defiance even when none existed, imposing punishments that went beyond what his master required, and taking a perverse satisfaction in the fear he inspired in other slaves. The system had successfully transformed a victim into an instrument of oppression. The corruption ran deeper than individual psychology. The slave system created institutional incentives that rewarded brutality and punished compassion. Overseers were judged solely on productivity and order, how much grain their workers harvested, how many goods their workshops produced, how few escape attempts occurred on their watch. A kind overseer who allowed slaves adequate rest, sufficient food, or humane treatment would quickly find his estate falling behind its competitors in profitability. Marcus Salvius, a freedman who managed a textile workshop in Rome, discovered this harsh reality when he attempted to implement more humane working conditions. He reduced the working day from 18 hours to 14, provided better food for his workers, and refused to use sexual coercion as a disciplinary tool. Within 6 months, his workshop's output had fallen compared to competing operations that maintained harsher regimes. His employer, faced with declining profits, replaced him with an overseer who immediately restored the previous brutal conditions and increased production beyond previous levels. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the enforcement system was how it turned slaves against each other. Masters deliberately created hierarchies among their slaves, offering small privileges and better treatment to those who informed on their fellow bondsmen. This created a climate of suspicion and paranoia, where slaves could never be certain which of their companions might betray them for a slightly larger food ration or protection from punishment. The position of custos or slave guard represented the ultimate corruption of human solidarity. These were slaves whose job was to prevent escapes, track down runaways, and maintain discipline in slave quarters. They were given slightly better food, simple weapons, and the authority to punish other slaves for minor infractions. In exchange, they were expected to abandon any loyalty to their fellow slaves and serve as the master's eyes and ears in the quarters. Gaius, a Dacian who had lost his family in the wars of conquest, accepted the position of custos after 5 years of field labor had broken his body and spirit. The small increase in status and the promise of better treatment for his remaining years alive seemed worth the moral compromise. But he soon discovered that his new role isolated him completely from the slave community that had been his only source of human connection. Other slaves viewed him as a traitor, while his masters saw him as merely a useful tool. He existed in a liminal space, neither fully trusted by his owners nor accepted by his fellow slaves. The enforcement system also relied on specialized roles that required slaves to participate in the brutalization of their peers. Slave executioners, called carnificers, were responsible for carrying out capital punishments, often in deliberately horrific ways designed to terrorize other slaves. These men were chosen from the slave population and given extensive training in torture techniques, crucifixion procedures, and methods of prolonging suffering for maximum psychological impact. Perhaps most tragic were the slave mothers who were forced to train and discipline slave children. These women, often separated from their own offspring, were required to teach newly enslaved children how to behave in ways that would minimize their chances of severe punishment. This meant breaking the children's spirits, teaching them to accept abuse without resistance, and preparing them for lives of absolute servitude. The mothers who performed this role faced an impossible choice. They could try to protect the children through harsh training that might save their lives, or they could refuse and watch the children suffer even worse fates at the hands of less caring supervisors. The system's genius lay in how it made everyone complicit in its continuation. Free Romans could maintain their comfortable lives while telling themselves that the cruelty was being carried out by the slaves themselves. Slave overseers could justify their brutality as necessary for survival. Even ordinary slaves were forced to make moral compromises, turning in escape plans to protect themselves, competing with fellow slaves for better assignments, or simply remaining silent when they witnessed abuse they were powerless to prevent. This web of complicity made resistance extraordinarily difficult. Slaves could not trust each other completely, as any one of them might be under pressure to serve as an informant. They could not appeal to the conscience of their overseers, who were themselves trapped in roles that required cruelty for survival. They could not even rely on their own moral certainty, as the daily compromises required for survival gradually eroded their sense of right and wrong. The enforcement system created a culture where violence was not just accepted but expected, where compassion was seen as weakness, and where the only way to improve one's situation was to participate in the oppression of others. It was a machine that consumed human dignity and produced broken people who then helped to break others, ensuring that the cycle of cruelty would continue indefinitely. The Roman slave system maintained its grip on millions of human beings through an elaborate machinery of terror that went far beyond simple physical punishment. This apparatus of control was designed not just to inflict pain but to break the human spirit so completely that resistance would become literally unthinkable. Understanding these mechanisms reveals why you would have faced not just hardship as a Roman slave, but a systematic assault on your very sense of self that few modern people could comprehend, let alone survive. The most visible component of this control system was the practice of public execution, carried out with such deliberate cruelty that the memory would haunt every slave who witnessed it. The crucifixion of rebellious slaves was not simply a method of execution, it was theater, carefully choreographed to maximize psychological impact on the surviving population. The Romans had perfected techniques for prolonging the agony of crucifixion for days, ensuring that the dying person's screams would echo across the countryside as a constant reminder of what awaited those who challenged their masters. When Lucius Valerius caught 3 of his agricultural slaves attempting to escape in the spring of 97 BCE, he chose to make their punishment a lesson for every slave on his estate and neighboring properties. Rather than simply executing the 3 men, he organized what amounted to a festival of torture. All slaves from the surrounding area, nearly 2,000 people, were forced to watch as the escapees were slowly flayed alive, their skin removed in strips while they remained conscious. Only after hours of this agony were they nailed to crosses positioned along the estate's main road. But the master's cruelty did not end with the execution of the guilty parties. He ordered that the crosses remain in place until the bodies had been completely consumed by carrion birds, a process that took several weeks. Every slave working in the fields was required to pass these rotting corpses daily, breathing the stench of decomposition and witnessing the slow reduction of human beings to scattered bones. Children born into slavery on that estate grew up with those crosses as part of their landscape, learning from their earliest memories that this was the fate that awaited anyone who dreamed of freedom. The psychological impact was precisely what Valerius intended. For months afterward, productivity on his estate reached unprecedented levels as slaves worked with desperate efficiency, terrified that any perceived laziness might mark them for similar treatment. More importantly, escape attempts in the region virtually ceased for over a year, as the image of those slowly dying men became burned into the consciousness of every enslaved person for miles around. The Romans understood that fear was most effective when it was unpredictable and arbitrary. Random punishment served to keep slaves in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing whether their next action might trigger savage retaliation. Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome, was famous for implementing a system on his estates where slaves were selected for punishment not based on any wrongdoing but through random lottery. Every 10th day, lots would be drawn and one slave would be chosen for brutal punishment regardless of their behavior or performance. This system of arbitrary violence created a psychological environment where slaves could never feel safe, no matter how perfectly they performed their duties. The knowledge that punishment could strike at any moment for no reason beyond random chance produced a form of learned helplessness that made resistance seem not just dangerous but pointless. If good behavior offered no protection, then the only rational response was complete submission and the hope that one's number would not be drawn. The control mechanisms extended beyond physical violence to sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation designed to reshape slaves' understanding of reality itself. Masters regularly employed techniques that modern psychologists would recognize as gaslighting, systematically undermining slaves' confidence in their own perceptions and memories. Slaves might be punished for failing to complete tasks they had never been assigned or praised for accomplishments they had not achieved, creating constant confusion about the relationship between their actions and their treatment. Food became another instrument of control used not just to maintain slaves' physical capacity for work but to reinforce their psychological dependence. The distribution of rations was deliberately made unpredictable and seemingly arbitrary. Some days slaves might receive adequate food while other days they would be given barely enough to survive. This unpredictability prevented slaves from developing any sense of entitlement to basic sustenance, forcing them to view even minimal food as a privilege granted by their master's generosity rather than a basic human need. The masters also manipulated information to maintain control over their slaves' understanding of the world beyond the estate. Slaves were forbidden from learning to read, not just to prevent them from forging documents or communicating with the outside world, but to ensure that their knowledge of politics, geography, and current events remained entirely dependent on what their masters chose to tell them. This information control meant that slaves often had no accurate understanding of where they were located, what alternatives might exist to their current situation, or whether anyone in the outside world might be sympathetic to their plight. Sexual violence served as another mechanism of control used not just to satisfy the desires of masters and overseers, but to reinforce the complete powerlessness of slaves over their own bodies. The rape of slave women was often carried out publicly, forcing other slaves to witness the violation of their friends and family members while being unable to intervene. This public sexual violence served multiple control functions. It satisfied the master's desire for dominance, humiliated the entire slave community, and reinforced the message that slaves had no rights that their owners were bound to respect. The system also employed sophisticated divide-and-conquer strategies designed to prevent slaves from forming the solidarity necessary for effective resistance. Masters deliberately created ethnic tensions by giving slaves from certain regions better treatment or more privileged positions, encouraging resentment between different groups. They also exploited religious differences, family rivalries, and personal grudges to ensure that the slave population remained fractured and suspicious of each other. Perhaps most insidiously, the Romans created false hope as a mechanism of control. the possibility of manumission being granted freedom was dangled before slaves as a reward for exceptional service and loyalty. However, masters ensured that this possibility remained tantalizingly remote for all but a tiny fraction of slaves. The hope of eventual freedom served to channel slaves' energy into competing with each other for their master's favor rather than uniting against the system that oppressed them all. The legal system reinforced every aspect of this psychological control by denying slaves any recourse or protection under law. A slave who reported abuse by their master could be punished for the mere act of complaining. A slave who defended themselves against assault could be executed for raising their hand against a free person. Even testimony from slaves was considered worthless in court unless it had been extracted under torture, reinforcing the message that their words, like their bodies, had no inherent value. This comprehensive system of control was designed to produce what we might today recognize as a form of institutionalized Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological state where victims develop positive feelings toward their oppressors as a survival mechanism. Slaves who had been broken by this system often became the most effective advocates for its continuation, genuinely believing that slavery was their natural condition and that their masters were benevolent providers rather than oppressors. Yet even within this carefully constructed machinery of dehumanization, there emerged moments that revealed the indestructible core of human dignity that no amount of cruelty could entirely extinguish. These glimpses of humanity, fleeting acts of compassion, unexpected bonds of loyalty, and quiet assertions of individual worth remind us that the people trapped within Roman slavery remained fundamentally human, capable of love, sacrifice, and moral courage even under the most crushing circumstances. In the household of Senator Gaius Flavius Antonius, an extraordinary friendship developed between two slaves whose very different circumstances might have made them natural enemies. Demetrius was a highly educated Greek who served as the senator's personal secretary and tutor to his children, enjoying relative comfort and the respect that came with his intellectual abilities. Castor was a Germanic laborer who worked in the senator's stone quarries, his body slowly being destroyed by years of hauling massive blocks under the scorching Italian sun. Their paths crossed during the fever epidemic of 112 BCE, when Castor collapsed in the quarry and was brought to the main house to prevent the disease from spreading among the valuable quarry workers. Demetrius, who had some knowledge of medicine from his education, volunteered to care for the sick man despite the risk of contagion, and the fact that associating with a common laborer could damage his own privileged position within the household. For 3 weeks, Demetrius nursed Castor back to health, sharing his own food rations, reading to him from Greek texts to pass the long hours of recovery, and gradually learning the story of the Germanic warrior who had been captured during a raid on Roman supply lines. What began as simple compassion evolved into genuine friendship as the two men discovered their shared experiences of loss, their common dreams of freedom, and their mutual respect for each other's strength in enduring their bondage. When Castor recovered and was returned to the quarries, the friendship might have ended, but Demetrius found ways to maintain their connection despite the rigid social barriers that separated educated household slaves from manual laborers. He would save portions of the better food he received and find opportunities to pass them to Castor. More importantly, he began teaching Castor to read Latin during brief moments when their work schedules allowed them to meet in hidden corners of the estate. This education represented enormous risk for both men. Slaves were forbidden from learning to read without explicit permission from their masters, and the penalty for unauthorized literacy could be severe mutilation or death. But Demetrius understood that knowledge was one of the few gifts he could offer his friend, while Castor grasped that literacy might someday provide opportunities for escape or advancement that would otherwise remain forever closed to him. Their friendship deepened when Castor's younger brother Flavus was captured in a subsequent raid and brought to the same estate. The boy, barely 14 years old, had been assigned to particularly dangerous work in the deepest parts of the quarry, where cave-ins regularly killed workers and toxic dust slowly poisoned their lungs. Castor begged Demetrius to intercede with the senator to have his brother reassigned to safer duties, knowing that his own pleas would carry no weight with their master. Demetrius faced a terrible dilemma. Using his influence to help Flavus would risk exposing their friendship and could result in punishment for both men. Moreover, advocating for a Germanic slave might undermine his own position as a trusted Greek intellectual, potentially leading to his own demotion to manual labor. But after watching Castor's anguish for several days, Demetrius chose to act despite the personal cost. He approached Senator Antonius with a carefully crafted argument that the young Germanic slave showed potential for intellectual development and might be valuable as an assistant in the household's educational activities. This was a complete fabrication. Flavus had no such abilities, but Demetrius presented it with enough conviction that the senator agreed to transfer the boy to lighter duties in the household gardens. The risk paid off, and Flavus's life was likely saved by his brother's friend's willingness to sacrifice his own security. The bonds between the three men continued to strengthen over the following years. Demetrius included Flavus in the secret reading lessons, while both Germanic brothers shared their knowledge of survival skills, military tactics, and the geography of their homeland, information that might prove valuable if escape ever became possible. They developed an elaborate system of coded communication that allowed them to share news, warnings, and support across the different areas of the estate where their duties kept them separated. Their friendship was tested most severely when Castor was selected for punishment in one of the master's arbitrary disciplinary actions. The senator had decreed that productivity in the quarries was insufficient and announced that one worker would be chosen by lot to receive 50 lashes as motivation for the others. When Castor's name was drawn, he faced not just the immediate agony of the beating but the likelihood that the punishment would leave him too injured to work effectively, marking him for sale to even harsher conditions elsewhere. Demetrius made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He approached the senator and offered to take Castor's punishment himself, arguing that his education made him better able to understand the moral lesson the beating was intended to convey. This was an unprecedented request. Educated household slaves were rarely subjected to such physical punishments, and for one to volunteer for another's suffering was virtually unheard of in Roman society. The senator was so intrigued by this unusual display that he agreed to the substitution, perhaps curious to see how his educated slave would endure the brutal punishment intended for a manual laborer. Demetrius received the 50 lashes in the courtyard while both brothers were forced to watch, maintaining his dignity throughout the ordeal and refusing to cry out despite the excruciating pain. The beating left him scarred for life, but Castor was spared and their friendship became legendary among the other slaves on the estate. The story of their bond reveals something profound about human nature under extreme duress. Despite a system designed to strip away every vestige of human connection and dignity, these three men created a family based on choice rather than blood, loyalty rather than law, and love rather than obligation. They proved that even within slavery's dehumanizing constraints, people could still choose to sacrifice for each other, to share knowledge and resources, and to maintain the fundamental human values that no amount of oppression could completely destroy. Their friendship also demonstrated how small acts of compassion could ripple outward to create larger networks of mutual support. Other slaves on the estate, inspired by their example, began forming their own alliances and support systems. The Germanic brothers' success in protecting each other through Demetrius's intervention encouraged other slaves to find creative ways to help their most vulnerable companions. The secret education sessions expanded to include other slaves who wanted to learn reading and survival skills. Yet their story also illustrates the tragic limitations imposed by slavery on even the most meaningful human connections. Despite years of friendship and mutual sacrifice, the three men remained property that could be separated, sold, or killed at their master's whim. Their love for each other existed entirely at the sufferance of a system that recognized no rights or relationships among slaves. The very actions that made their friendship beautiful and meaningful, the willingness to sacrifice, the sharing of knowledge, the creation of family bonds, also made them vulnerable to even greater suffering if their masters chose to exploit these connections. Now we must confront one of the most disturbing truths about Roman civilization, that every monument we admire, every innovation we celebrate, every cultural achievement we study today was built upon the suffering of the very people whose existence we have been exploring. The magnificent legacy of Rome cannot be separated from the human cost that made it possible, and understanding this connection reveals why you would not have lasted a day as a Roman slave within a system that consumed human lives to feed its appetite for grandeur. Consider the Circus Maximus, that architectural marvel that could hold over 250,000 spectators and represented the pinnacle of Roman engineering and social organization. Modern visitors to Rome still marvel at its scale and sophistication, imagining the excitement of chariot races and the roar of crowds that once filled its massive arena. But the true foundation of the Circus Maximus was not the carefully fitted stones or ingenious drainage systems that archaeologists study today. It was the broken bodies of thousands of slaves who died quarrying, transporting, and assembling those stones under conditions that would horrify any modern construction worker. The marble that gives Roman architecture its timeless beauty came from quarries in the mountains of Carrara, where enslaved workers labored in conditions that can only be described as a form of slow-motion execution. These men worked 12-hour shifts in underground tunnels, breathing air thick with marble dust that gradually destroyed their lungs. The average life expectancy of a quarry slave was less than 3 years from the time of assignment, but the steady supply of new captives from Rome's endless wars ensured that production never ceased. Archaeological evidence from these quarrying sites reveals the true human cost of Roman marble. Skeletal remains show clear signs of silicosis, the lung disease caused by inhaling stone dust, as well as crushing injuries from falling blocks and repetitive stress damage from years of working with primitive tools. Yet these same quarries produced the marble that adorned the Pantheon, the Forum of Trajan, and countless temples and public buildings that tourists photograph today as symbols of classical beauty and achievement. The transportation of this marble required an equally devastating expenditure of human life. Massive blocks weighing several tons each had to be moved from mountain quarries to seaports, then loaded onto ships and transported to Rome, where they would be hauled to construction sites throughout the city. This process relied on teams of slaves working with ropes, pulleys, and sheer physical strength to move loads that would challenge modern machinery. Ancient records mention cargo ships arriving in Rome with marble shipments, but without significant portions of their slave crews who had died during the arduous journey. The construction process itself was designed around the assumption that human life was the cheapest and most expendable resource available to Roman builders. Rather than developing safer techniques or better equipment, Roman engineers simply calculated how many slaves would likely be killed during each phase of construction and ensured that adequate replacements were available. The speed with which massive projects like the Colosseum were completed, less than 8 years from start to finish, was possible only because planners were willing to accept casualty rates that would be inconceivable in any modern construction project. But the price of Roman greatness extended far beyond individual building projects. The entire economic system that supported Roman culture and learning depended on slave labor to free citizens from the necessity of productive work. The philosophers whose ideas still influence Western thought, the poets whose verses are still memorized by students, the historians whose accounts shape our understanding of the ancient world, all of them were able to pursue their intellectual activities only because enslaved people handled every aspect of daily survival. The great library of Trajan contained over 1 million scrolls representing the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. This magnificent collection, which served as a model for libraries throughout the empire, was maintained by a staff of nearly 500 slaves who copied manuscripts, organized collections, and provided research assistance to Roman scholars. These enslaved librarians were often highly educated Greeks and Egyptians who had been captured during military campaigns, but their intellectual abilities were considered property of the Roman state rather than personal attributes deserving of respect or compensation. The copying of manuscripts alone required enormous amounts of slave labor, as each book had to be reproduced entirely by hand. A single copy of Homer's Iliad required approximately 200 hours of careful writing by a skilled scribe, and the library's collection included hundreds of copies of major works to meet the demand from Roman citizens who wanted to appear cultured and educated. The slaves who performed this work often developed permanent injuries to their hands and eyes from the repetitive motions and poor lighting conditions. But their suffering was invisible to the scholars who benefited from their labor. The very foods that sustained Roman civilization required the systematic exploitation of agricultural slaves, whose lives were considered less valuable than the crops they tended. The grain that fed the city of Rome came from vast estates in Sicily and North Africa, where enslaved workers labored under conditions designed to maximize production while minimizing costs. These agricultural slaves faced some of the harshest conditions in the Roman world, working from dawn to dusk during planting and harvest seasons with minimal food, shelter, or medical care. The famous Roman cuisine that food historians celebrate today, the elaborate banquets with exotic spices, rare wines, and artistic presentations that demonstrated the host's wealth and sophistication, was prepared entirely by enslaved cooks who were forbidden to taste the dishes they created. These kitchen slaves worked 18-hour days during major social events, standing over hot fires in poorly ventilated spaces while preparing meals they would never be allowed to enjoy. The irony is profound. The very people who created the culinary masterpieces that defined Roman high culture were excluded from participating in the cultural life their labor made possible. The luxury goods that filled Roman homes and demonstrated the owner's status in society, fine textiles, jewelry, furniture, artwork, were all produced by slaves whose artistic talents were considered property rather than personal gifts. Skilled craftsmen who might have been celebrated artists in free societies were instead treated as living tools, their creativity channeled into objects that would bring glory to their masters while leaving their own names unrecorded, and their contributions unacknowledged. Perhaps most tragically, the infrastructure that supported Roman communication and administration, the roads, bridges, and aqueducts that modern engineers still study as marvels of practical design, was built by enslaved workers whose own families were often scattered across the empire by the very transportation networks they helped create. The roads that enabled Roman armies to move quickly to suppress rebellions also separated enslaved parents from their children and husbands from their wives, making family reunification virtually impossible even for those who might eventually gain their freedom. The aqueducts that brought fresh water to Roman cities represented some of the most sophisticated engineering achievements of the ancient world, with precisely calculated gradients that carried water across hundreds of miles using only gravity. But this engineering marvel was constructed by slaves working in dangerous conditions, building massive arches and digging tunnels through solid rock using tools that differed little from those available to Bronze Age workers. The death toll for these projects was so high that entire sections of aqueduct construction were planned around the assumption that most workers would not survive to see the project's completion. Understanding this connection between Roman achievement and slave suffering reveals why the title of our exploration is so apt. You would not have lasted a day as a Roman slave, not because the work was merely difficult, but because you would have been consumed by a system that viewed human life as fuel for civilization. Every breath you took, every moment of consciousness you experienced, every spark of creativity or intelligence you possessed would have been considered the property of someone else, valuable only insofar as it could be converted into glory, wealth, or power for your owners. As our journey through this dark chapter of human history draws toward its close, let us pause to remember some of the individual souls whose stories illuminate the broader tragedy we have explored. These are not the famous names that appear in history books, but ordinary people whose extraordinary courage and endurance deserve to be remembered alongside the monuments their suffering helped create. Aurelia was 7 years old when pirates raided her village on the coast of Thrace, killing her parents and capturing the children to sell in the slave markets of Asia Minor. She spent the next 15 years of her life in the household of a Roman textile merchant in Ephesus, learning to weave the fine fabrics that wealthy Romans prized for their softness and intricate patterns. Her small fingers were perfect for the delicate work of creating complex designs, but the constant strain of working bent over looms gradually curved her spine and weakened her eyesight. Despite the hardships of her daily existence, Aurelia found ways to preserve fragments of her lost childhood. She remembered songs her mother had sung to her, and she would hum these melodies quietly while she worked, keeping alive the memory of a world where she had been loved rather than owned. When younger slave children were brought to the workshop, she would teach them these same songs, creating invisible threads of connection that linked them to something beyond their current suffering. Aurelia's story might have ended in anonymous obscurity, but fate intervened when her master's business failed and his household was sold to pay his debts. At 22, after 15 years of faithful service, she was sold to a brothel owner who planned to exploit her in ways that would destroy whatever remained of her spirit. Rather than submit to this final degradation, Aurelia chose to end her life by drinking poison she had somehow obtained from the workshop's dying supplies. She died quietly in her small cell, perhaps dreaming of her mother's voice singing the lullabies of her lost homeland. Marcus was a Germanic warrior captured during one of Caesar's campaigns, a man who had once led raids against Roman settlements and dreamed of driving the invaders from his people's lands. Enslaved at 25, he was assigned to work in the copper mines of Spain, where the toxic fumes and backbreaking labor were designed to extract maximum value from human bodies before discarding them. Most men assigned to these mines died within 2 years, but Marcus survived for nearly a decade through sheer force of will and an unbreakable determination to live long enough to see his homeland again. In the depths of the mines, Marcus became a source of strength for his fellow slaves, sharing what little food he could spare with those who were weaker, teaching survival techniques he had learned as a warrior, and keeping alive the hope that someday they might find freedom. He organized the miners into informal groups that watched out for each other, developed systems for rotating the most dangerous assignments, and created networks of mutual support that helped many men survive longer than they would have alone. Marcus died as he had lived, protecting others. When a tunnel collapsed during his 10th year in the mines, he could have escaped with several other workers, but he chose to stay behind to dig out 2 younger slaves who were trapped beneath the fallen rocks. He managed to free both men before the unstable ceiling came down again, crushing him beneath tons of stone. His sacrifice saved 2 lives, but his own death went unrecorded in any official document. He was simply another mining casualty, replaced by fresh slaves brought in the next shipment from the Germanic frontier. Then there was Julia, a young woman from Gaul who possessed extraordinary intelligence and was trained as a scribe in the household of a Roman senator. Her ability to read, write, and keep complex records made her valuable enough to receive better treatment than most slaves. But this privilege came with its own form of suffering. She was forced to transcribe correspondence about the slave trade, recording the buying and selling of human beings with the same clinical precision used for livestock transactions. For 12 years, Julia wrote letters arranging the purchase of children torn from their families, documented the punishment of slaves who had attempted escape, and maintained records of breeding programs designed to produce new generations of human property. Each document she created was a small betrayal of her own people and her own humanity, but refusing to perform these duties would have meant death or assignment to far worse conditions. Julia's torment was not just professional but deeply personal. She was required to write love letters for a master to his various mistresses, knowing that her own capacity for love was considered irrelevant to her function as a tool. She transcribed poems celebrating freedom and virtue for a man who owned 50 human beings, and she copied philosophical treatises about human dignity while living as property herself. The irony of her situation became unbearable when she was ordered to transcribe her master's will, which granted freedom to his favorite hunting dogs while leaving all his slaves, including Julia herself, to be divided among his heirs like furniture. That night, she used her writing skills for the last time, composing a letter to a slave she had loved from afar, expressing feelings she had never been allowed to voice aloud. She hid the letter in the scroll room where it might someday be found, then hanged herself from the ceiling beams with a rope made from strips of papyrus. Yet amidst these stories of suffering and tragedy, we must also acknowledge those rare individuals who managed to transcend their circumstances and achieve something approaching dignity within the confines of slavery. These exceptional few remind us that the human spirit, though battered and broken, can sometimes find ways to rise above even the most crushing oppression. Their stories are not meant to diminish the suffering of the millions who never escaped their bondage, but to illuminate the extraordinary courage required to maintain hope in a world designed to extinguish it. Apollodorus was a Greek physician who had been captured during the sack of Corinth and sold to a wealthy Roman family suffering from a plague that had killed several household members. His medical knowledge, rare and valuable in an age when most healing was based on superstition rather than science, quickly made him indispensable to his new masters. But Apollodorus understood that his value as a slave physician put him in a unique position to help not just his owners, but his fellow slaves who suffered from diseases and injuries with no hope of treatment. Working under the cover of his official duties, Apollodorus began secretly treating sick slaves throughout the household and eventually in neighboring estates. He taught basic hygiene and herbal remedies to slave women who could then care for their children and companions. Most dangerously, he began providing contraceptive knowledge to enslaved women who wished to avoid bringing children into bondage, despite the fact that helping slaves prevent pregnancy could be punished by death. Over 15 years, Apollodorus developed an underground network of slave healers across the region, training others in medical techniques and creating a system where knowledge could be preserved and passed down even if individual practitioners were discovered and punished. His network saved hundreds of lives and prevented countless children from being born into slavery. When he was finally granted freedom at age 55, Apollodorus chose to remain in Rome and continued his work, now operating openly as a physician who treated slaves alongside free patients, something virtually unheard of in Roman society. Cassia represented a different form of transcendence, the power of artistic creation to assert human dignity even within dehumanizing circumstances. Born into slavery on a large estate in Campania, she showed extraordinary talent for music and was trained to entertain her master's guests at elaborate dinner parties. But rather than simply performing the songs chosen for her, Cassia began composing her own music, weaving into her melodies the traditional songs of her Celtic homeland and creating new lyrics that spoke to the experiences of enslaved people. Her compositions spread throughout the slave quarters, carried by other musicians and household workers who learned her songs and taught them to slaves on distant estates. These songs served multiple purposes. They preserved cultural memories that slavery was designed to erase, provided emotional catharsis for people who had few outlets for their grief and anger, and created a sense of shared identity among slaves who might otherwise have remained isolated in their suffering. The subversive power of Cassia's music became apparent when Roman authorities began to worry about the effect her songs were having on slave populations. Several minor revolts were reportedly organized using musical signals based on her compositions, and slaves across the empire were singing songs that, while seemingly harmless entertainment, actually contained coded messages about resistance and hope. When her master finally learned of her unauthorized compositions, he faced a dilemma. Cassia's musical abilities were too valuable to waste, but her influence was becoming dangerous to the stability of the slave system. The solution was characteristically Roman in its calculated cruelty. Cassia was sold to a gladiatorial school, where her musical talents would be used to entertain audiences between combat events, effectively silencing her subversive influence while still extracting value from her abilities. But even in this new environment, Cassia continued to compose, creating funeral songs for fallen gladiators that became legendary for their beauty and power. She died at 28, killed during a riot when the gladiatorial school was attacked by escaped slaves who were trying to free their imprisoned comrades. Perhaps most remarkable was the story of Lucius Antonius Felix, a slave who achieved something almost unprecedented in Roman society: genuine intellectual respect from free citizens who knew his true status. Born to slave parents in Rome, Felix showed extraordinary aptitude for mathematics and engineering. His master, recognizing this talent, allowed him to study with Greek tutors and eventually work alongside free engineers on major construction projects. Felix's innovations in hydraulic engineering revolutionized the design of Roman aqueducts and bathhouses, solving technical problems that had stumped free engineers for decades. His mathematical calculations enabled the construction of larger and more stable domes, and his mechanical inventions improved the efficiency of mills and workshops throughout the empire. Roman engineers began requesting Felix specifically for their most challenging projects, and his reputation spread throughout the construction industry. What made Felix's case truly exceptional was that he managed to gain recognition for his intellectual contributions while remaining legally enslaved. Technical manuals began citing his innovations by name, something virtually unheard of for slave contributions to Roman knowledge. When his master died, Felix's reputation was so established that the heir chose not to sell him, but instead granted him substantial autonomy to work as an independent consultant while remaining technically enslaved. Felix used this unusual position to advocate for better treatment of construction slaves, arguing that improved conditions would lead to higher quality work and fewer accidents. His technical authority gave weight to these humanitarian arguments in ways that moral appeals never could have achieved. He eventually earned enough money to purchase his freedom at age 40 and continued working as a free engineer, becoming one of the few former slaves whose name appeared in official records of major public works projects. These exceptional individuals succeeded not by working within the system but by finding ways to transcend it while technically remaining trapped within its constraints. They proved that human creativity, intelligence, and compassion could flourish even under the most oppressive conditions, but their very exceptionality highlights how extraordinary it was for anyone to achieve dignity within Roman slavery. As we reach the end of our journey through the darkest chapters of Roman history, we must confront a final sobering truth. The world we inhabit today still bears the traces of the system we have explored. The roads you drive on follow routes first laid out by enslaved hands. The legal principles that govern our societies evolved from Roman law that treated human beings as property. The architectural styles that grace our public buildings draw inspiration from monuments built with slave labor. The very concept of Western civilization itself is inseparable from the institution that made Roman grandeur possible. This is not ancient history that we can safely consign to the distant past. The legacy of Roman slavery flows through centuries like an underground river, surfacing in the plantation economies of the New World, the industrial labor systems of the 19th century, and the global supply chains that still depend on exploited workers today. Understanding this connection is not an exercise in historical guilt, but a recognition that the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience revealed in ancient Rome continues to shape our world in ways we are only beginning to acknowledge. When you walk through the ruins of the Roman Forum or stand before the Pantheon's soaring dome, remember that these monuments exist because millions of human beings never had the chance to live full lives, to raise their children in freedom, or to pursue their own dreams and aspirations. Every marble column represents years stolen from human lives. Every perfect arch embodies the mathematical precision of enslaved engineers whose names were never recorded. Every intricate mosaic was created by artists who were forbidden to sign their work or claim credit for their genius. But remembering the cost of Roman greatness is not enough. We must also honor the memory of those who resisted, who maintained their humanity despite systematic attempts to strip it away, who found ways to love and hope and create even within the most crushing oppression. They remind us that no system, however total it appears, can completely extinguish the human spirit. Their courage in the face of unimaginable hardship challenges us to examine our own responses to injustice and to ask ourselves whether we would have their strength if faced with similar circumstances. The answer, if we are honest, is probably no. You would not have lasted a day as a Roman slave, not because you lack courage or determination, but because the system was designed to break human beings down to their component parts and rebuild them as instruments of someone else's will. The very qualities that make you human, your independence, your sense of self-worth, your ability to make choices about your own life, would have been systematically destroyed by methods perfected over centuries of practice. Yet in acknowledging our own likely failure, we also acknowledge the extraordinary nature of those who did survive, who did resist, who did maintain their humanity against impossible odds. They were not superhuman, but they possess something that transcends individual strength, the knowledge that their lives had meaning beyond their usefulness to their oppressors. This knowledge sustained them through horrors that would break most of us, and enabled them to preserve fragments of dignity that could be passed down to others. The slaves of ancient Rome have been dead for over 1,000 years, but their struggle continues in every corner of our world where human beings are treated as disposable resources rather than individuals deserving of respect and protection. Their memory calls us to recognize the enslaved workers who harvest our food, manufacture our clothes, and mine the metals in our electronic devices. It challenges us to see the connections between ancient injustices and modern exploitation, between the Roman citizen who enjoyed luxuries provided by slave labor and the contemporary consumer who benefits from global systems that depend on human suffering. This recognition is not meant to paralyze us with guilt, but to inspire us to action. The Romans who profited from slavery told themselves that their victims were naturally inferior, that the system was ordained by the gods, that any attempt to change it would lead to chaos and economic collapse. We know these justifications were lies designed to preserve an unjust system that benefited the few at the expense of the many. When we hear similar arguments today about why exploitation must continue, why certain people deserve their suffering, why changing the system would be too disruptive or expensive, we can recognize them as variations on ancient themes. The memory of Roman slaves reminds us that human dignity is not negotiable, that no economic benefit can justify the systematic dehumanization of our fellow human beings, and that the true measure of a civilization is not its monuments or its wealth, but how it treats its most vulnerable members. In honoring their memory, we commit ourselves to building a world where no one would have to endure what they endured, where human value is not measured by productivity or profit, and where the dream of freedom they carried in their hearts finally becomes reality for all people. Their voices, silenced by centuries but preserved in our collective memory, whisper to us across time, remember us, learn from our suffering, do better. Still awake? If you found yourself drawn into tonight's mysteries, we've got more secrets waiting in the shadows. Just click to uncover what lies ahead. And hey, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so these late night revelations find their way to you whenever we unveil the next chapter